At September 0704 hours on November 8, 1942, the forward turret of the French battleship Jean Bart rotated slowly toward the harbor entrance at Casablanca, Morocco. Through the fire control director, Captain Paul Ronark watched American ships approaching through the morning haze. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, transports packed with landing craft, an invasion fleet. The United States Navy was attacking French North Africa, and Jean Bart was the only heavy gun capable of stopping them. The battleship was unfinished. Her aft turret existed only as an empty barbette, the massive guns never installed. Her secondary armament was incomplete. Half her fire control systems were inoperative. She had no propulsion. Her engines were disassembled on the dock, awaiting parts that would never arrive. She could not move, could not maneuver, could not retreat. She was a 35,000-ton stationary gun platform with one operational turret mounting four 380mm guns, the largest weapons in Casablanca, positioned to defend the harbor she could not leave. Ronark had 30 seconds to decide whether to open fire on ships flying the American flagships, crewed by men who were supposed to be Allies ships that had come to liberate North Africa from Vichy French control. His orders from Vichy were explicit: defend French territory against all attackers. But his conscience was screaming that firing on Americans was madness, that France and America should not be enemies, that this entire situation was a betrayal of everything the French Navy had fought for. At 0704 and 30 seconds, Jean Bart's forward turret fired its first salvo. Four 380mm shells, each weighing 884 kilograms, arced across 14 miles of ocean toward the American heavy cruiser USS Augusta. The shells straddled Augusta, one falling short, one, long two, close enough to drench the cruiser's deck with spray. Admiral Hewitt, commanding the invasion fleet from Augusta's flag bridge, watched the shell splashes and made his decision. The French were resisting. The invasion would be opposed. For the next 3 days, Jean Bart would fight the most bizarre naval action of World War II. A battleship that could not move would duel with American warships. A crew that did not want to fight would fire on allies they respected. French sailors who had fled France to escape German occupation would defend a Vichy regime that collaborated with Germany. And eventually that crew would simply stop fighting, not because they were defeated, but because they refused to continue killing Americans in defense of a government they despised. The story of Jean Bart began 4 years earlier in December 1936, when the French Navy laid down two Richelieu-class battleships at two different shipyards. Richelieu was built at Brest. Jean Bart was built at Chantier de l'Atlantique in Saint-Nazaire. The ships were designed as responses to German and Italian battleship construction fast capital ships, mounting 8 300mm guns in two quadruple turrets, positioned forward of the superstructure. This unconventional layout maximized armor protection by concentrating all main armament forward, reducing the armored citadel's length and weight. The design was innovative. The 380mm model 1935 gun was among the most powerful naval rifles in the world, firing an 884-kilogram armor-piercing shell to a maximum range of 41 kilometers at 35 degrees elevation. Rate of fire was approximately 2 rounds per minute per gun under ideal conditions. The quadruple turret mounting was complex but efficient, allowing 8 guns to be carried in 2 turrets rather than 3 or 4. Maximum speed was designed to be 32 knots, making the Richelieu class among the fastest battleships afloat. Armor protection was extensive: 330mm belt armor, 70mm armor, 430mm turret face armor. The ships were intended to match or exceed any battleship they might encounter. But Jean Bart's construction was plagued by delays. Funding shortages slowed work. Design changes required modifications during construction. Labor disputes disrupted production schedules. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and France entered the war, Jean Bart was perhaps 75% complete. Her hull was finished, her superstructure erected, her forward turret installed. But her aft turret was not mounted, her engines were not fully installed, and secondary systems remained incomplete. Work continued through the winter of 1939-1940, but slowly. The French Navy prioritized completing Richelieu already more advanced. Jean Bart would have to wait. Then in May 1940, Germany invaded France. Within 6 weeks, French forces were collapsing. The government was evacuating to Bordeaux. German tanks were racing toward the Atlantic coast. Saint-Nazaire, where Jean Bart sat incomplete, would soon be in German hands. On June 19, 1940, with German forces approaching Saint-Nazaire, the French Navy made a desperate decision. Jean Bart would sail for Casablanca, immediately incomplete and barely seaworthy, rather than let her fall into German hands. The Battleship had been launched in March 1940, but had never conducted sea trials. Her engines were partially installed but not fully tested. Her aft turret was an empty barbette with no guns. Her fire control systems were incomplete. She had no anti-aircraft guns except a few machine guns, but she could float and her forward turret was operational, and that would have to be enough. At 0500 hours on June 19th, tugs pulled Jean Bart from her fitting-out berth. With only one functioning boiler and a skeleton crew, she began moving down the Loire River toward the Atlantic. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted her and attacked. Bombs fell around the battleship, but scored no hits. French fighters from nearby airfields provided what cover they could, but the Luftwaffe controlled the skies over France. Jean Bart reached the Atlantic and turned south, steaming at barely 16 knots on one boiler. German aircraft attacked repeatedly. Submarines were reported in her path. The crew, many of whom were dockyard workers, pressed into service at the last minute, worked frantically to make the ship operational. Engineers brought additional boilers online. Gunners tested the forward turret. Damage control parties sealed compartments and prepared for action. After 4 days at sea, Jean Bart reached Casablanca on June 22, 1940, the same day France signed the armistice with Germany. The battleship tied up at the main quay in Casablanca harbor. She had escaped German capture, but her problems were just beginning. Casablanca was in French Morocco, part of the French colonial empire now controlled by the Vichy government that had agreed to armistice terms with Germany. The armistice required that French warships be demobilized under German and Italian supervision. The French Navy refused to allow this. The fleet scattered to various ports, some to Toulon in southern France, some to Alexandria in Egypt, some to British ports, and some to French colonial harbors like Casablanca and Dakar. The ships would remain under French control, but they would not fight for either the Axis or the Allies. They would remain neutral, defending French neutrality against anyone who violated it. This position was untenable. Britain could not accept powerful French warships potentially falling under German control. On July 3, 1940, British forces attacked French ships at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria, sinking or damaging several capital ships and killing 297 French sailors. The attack traumatized the French Navy and created lasting bitterness toward Britain. French sailors who had been fighting alongside the Royal Navy weeks earlier now viewed the British as murderers. Jean Bart sat in Casablanca incomplete and immobile, while French-British relations deteriorated. The battleship's crew worked to finish their ship with whatever materials they could scavenge or fabricate locally. They installed additional anti-aircraft guns purchased from Sweden. They completed fire control systems using parts cannibalized from other ships. They trained constantly, knowing that someday they might have to fight. But fight whom the Germans had occupied northern France, but had left Vichy French territories nominally independent. The British had attacked at Mers el-Kebir and were blockading French colonial ports. The Americans were technically neutral, but clearly sympathizing with Britain. Jean Bart's crew existed in a bizarre limbo, serving a government that collaborated with Germany, while personally despising the Nazis, refusing to join the British after Mers el-Kebir, waiting for a resolution that never came. By November 1942, Jean Bart had been in Casablanca for over 2 years. The ship remained incomplete, but she was substantially more operational than when she arrived. The forward turret was fully functional, with all 4 380mm guns operational. Secondary armament included 12 90mm anti-aircraft guns, 8 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and numerous machine guns. Fire control systems were working, though not optimal. Ammunition stocks were adequate for sustained combat. What the ship lacked was propulsion. The engines remained disassembled, awaiting parts from France that could not be delivered due to Allied blockade. Captain Ronarch commanded a crew of approximately 500 men. Many had been with the ship since Saint-Nazaire. They had fled France together, endured the voyage to Casablanca, spent 2 years making their incomplete ship as operational as possible. They were professionals, well-trained, competent. They were also increasingly divided about whom they were serving and why. The crew included officers and men loyal to Vichy who believed they were following legitimate French government orders. Others were secretly Gaullists, supporting General Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces fighting alongside the Allies. Still others were simply confused, trapped between loyalty to their immediate commanders and their recognition that Vichy collaboration with Germany was wrong. This division would become critical when the Americans arrived. American planning for Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, anticipated French resistance, but hoped it would be minimal. The plan called for simultaneous landings at 3 locations: Casablanca on the Atlantic coast, Oran, and Algiers on the Mediterranean coast. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the operation, believed many French forces would welcome liberation from Vichy control. He hoped French commanders would see reason and order their forces not to resist. The hope was not entirely unfounded. General Henri Giraud, a French officer who had escaped from German captivity, had been spirited out of France by the Allies and was prepared to call on French forces to join the Allied cause. But the situation was more complicated than American planners understood. French officers took their oaths seriously. They had sworn loyalty to the government of France, which was the Vichy government. Abandoning that oath, even to join the Allies, was a profound moral and professional crisis. At Casablanca, the American Western Task Force under Rear Admiral Hewitt approached the coast before dawn on November 8, 1942. The force included the battleship USS Massachusetts, the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, 4 light cruisers, numerous destroyers, and dozens of transports carrying the 3rd Infantry Division. The plan called for landings at multiple beaches around Casablanca with naval gunfire support from Massachusetts and the cruisers. Intelligence reports indicated that Jean Bart was in Casablanca harbor, but was incomplete and possibly non-operational. American planners did not consider the battleship a serious threat. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Jean Bart's forward turret was fully operational, and her fire control systems, though incomplete, were functional enough to engage targets at long range. At 0640 hours, American landing craft began approaching the beaches. At 0654, shore batteries opened fire. At 0700, French destroyers sortied from Casablanca harbor to attack the invasion fleet. At 0704, Jean Bart opened fire with her forward turret targeting Augusta. The first salvo straddled the American cruiser. Ronarch's gunners had achieved a near miss on their first attempt at 14-mile range, an impressive feat of fire control. Augusta returned fire with her 8-inch guns, but the range was extreme for cruiser weapons. The shells fell short. USS Massachusetts, the American battleship positioned off the coast to provide fire support for the landings, was assigned the mission of neutralizing Jean Bart. Massachusetts was a South Dakota-class battleship completed in 1942, mounting 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. She was fully operational, mobile, and heavily armored. Against her, Jean Bart was immobile, incomplete, with only 4 guns operational. The mismatch appeared overwhelming. At 0708, Massachusetts opened fire on Jean Bart at a range of 24,000 yards. The first salvo missed shells falling into the harbor. Massachusetts corrected and fired again. The second salvo straddled Jean Bart, 1 shell hitting the quay alongside the battleship, another splashing into the harbor just beyond. Jean Bart returned fire, her 4 380mm guns targeting Massachusetts. For the next 2 hours, the 2 battleships exchanged fire at extreme range. Massachusetts fired 786 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. Jean Bart fired 170 rounds of 300mm ammunition. The duel was extraordinary, an incomplete, immobile French battleship dueling with one of America's newest battleships across miles of ocean, each trying to achieve hits on a target visible only through optical rangefinders and fire control calculators. Massachusetts scored 5 hits on Jean Bart during the morning engagement. 1 16-inch shell penetrated Jean Bart's thin deck armor and detonated in an oil tank, starting a fire that was quickly controlled. Another hit damaged the forward turret's barbette, jamming one of the 4 guns. 3 other hits caused structural damage but did not seriously impair the ship's fighting capability. Jean Bart scored no direct hits on Massachusetts, but several near misses damaged the American battleship's fire control systems and wounded several crew members with splinters. The French battleship's gunnery was accurate and professional. Ronarc's crew was demonstrating that even an incomplete warship could be a serious threat when properly handled. At 09:15, Massachusetts broke off the engagement to support the amphibious landings, which were encountering heavy resistance from French shore batteries and the destroyer sortie from Casablanca. Jean Bart ceased fire, conserving ammunition and allowing damage control parties to assess the morning's battle damage. The forward turret had fired 170 rounds, more than 10% of its total ammunition supply. Several guns needed barrel maintenance. Fire control systems had been damaged by near misses. But the ship remained operational and defiant. Ronarch reported the engagement to Admiral François Michelier, commanding French naval forces in Morocco. Michelier ordered Jean Bart to continue resisting. The American invasion was illegal aggression against French territory and would be opposed with all available forces. Ronarch acknowledged the order, but his crew was beginning to question what they were doing. The men could see American forces landing on beaches, could see transports unloading equipment, could see landing craft ferrying troops ashore. This was not a raid. This was an invasion, a liberation. The Americans had come to free North Africa from Axis control to recruit French forces to the Allied cause. Why were they shooting at Americans? Why were they defending Vichy, a government that collaborated with the Germans who occupied France? These questions spread through the crew during the morning lull. Officers who were secretly Gaullist began quietly suggesting that continued resistance was wrong. Sailors who had family in occupied France questioned whether defending Vichy made any sense. The mood aboard Jean Bart was shifting from determined resistance toward reluctant compliance with orders the crew no longer believed in. At 15:06 hours, the situation became more complicated. American carrier aircraft from USS Ranger attacked Jean Bart with bombs and torpedoes. Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers approached at low altitude, dropping torpedoes aimed at the immobile battleship. Jean Bart's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, shooting down 1 aircraft and damaging 2 others. Most torpedoes missed running into the harbor bottom or the quay. but one torpedo hit Jean Bart on the port side forward, near the bow. The explosion flooded several compartments but caused no critical damage. The battleship's torpedo protection system, though incomplete, had worked adequately. The air attack was followed by dive bombers. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Ranger attacked Jean Bart with 1,000-pound bombs. Several bombs hit the battleship, one penetrating the forward turret and detonating inside, killing 8 men and wounding 40 others. The explosion damaged 2 of the turret's 4 guns, leaving only 2 operational. Another bomb hit the superstructure, destroying fire control systems and communications equipment. By late afternoon on November 8th, Jean Bart was badly damaged. The forward turret had only 2 operational guns. Fire control was degraded. Communication with Shore Command was disrupted. Casualties were mounting, but the ship was still floating, still fighting, still defiant. Roanoke ordered his crew to continue preparations for further action. That night, November 8-9, the crew of Jean Bart held informal discussions throughout the ship. Officers and men gathered in small groups discussing what they should do. The conversations were careful, tentative. Nobody wanted to be accused of mutiny, but the sentiment was clear. Continued fighting made no sense. The Americans were not enemies. Vichy was not worth dying for. France's real enemies were the Germans occupying their homeland, not the Americans trying to liberate North Africa. Senior officers who supported de Gaulle began arguing openly that Jean Bart should cease resistance. Other officers, loyal to their oaths to Vichy, insisted they had to continue following orders from Admiral Michelier. The debate continued through the night with no clear resolution. Roanoke remained in his cabin, aware of the discussions but unwilling to interfere. He knew his crew was divided, knew morale was collapsing, knew that continued fighting would result in more casualties for no strategic purpose. On November 9th, American forces consolidated their beachheads and began advancing inland. French resistance ashore was weakening as local commanders made their own decisions about whether to continue fighting. At Oran and Algiers, French forces were negotiating ceasefires. At Casablanca, the situation remained tense, but it was clear the Americans had overwhelming superiority and would eventually capture the city. Massachusetts returned to shell Jean Bart at dawn on November 10th. The American battleship fired 40 rounds of 16-inch ammunition at the French battleship, scoring 2 more hits. One shell penetrated Jean Bart's deck and detonated in a machinery space, causing flooding and further damage. Another hit destroyed the remaining fire control director. Jean Bart attempted to return fire with her 2 remaining operational guns, but fire control was so degraded that accurate shooting was impossible. The French battleship fired 15 rounds, all misses. At 7:45, Roanoke ordered cease fire. The forward turret had only 40 rounds of ammunition remaining. Fire control was inoperative. Further resistance was pointless. But Roanoke did not surrender. He simply stopped shooting. This was a critical distinction. Jean Bart did not haul down her flag or signal surrender. The crew remained at battle stations. The ship was still theoretically resisting. But the guns were silent. Admiral Michelier, ashore in Casablanca, demanded to know why Jean Bart had ceased fire. Roanoke's response was carefully worded: fire control systems inoperative, ammunition critically low, continued engagement would serve no purpose. He did not say he was surrendering. He was simply stating facts that made continued fighting impossible. This was the mutiny that wasn't quite a mutiny. The crew had not refused orders. They had simply stopped executing orders that made no sense. Officers had not rebelled against their commanders. They had simply informed their commanders that further action was technically impossible. It was resistance through bureaucratic obstruction, a particularly French form of disobedience that allowed everyone to maintain the appearance of following orders while actually doing nothing. Over the next 48 hours, the fiction continued. Jean Bart remained at battle stations. American forces captured Casablanca, but did not board Jean Bart. French naval authorities did not formally surrender the ship. The battleship existed in legal limbo, neither surrendered nor fighting, neither captured nor free. On November 11th, Admiral François Darlan, commander of all Vichy French forces, ordered a ceasefire throughout North Africa. Darlan had been in Algiers when the invasion began and had negotiated with American commanders. He agreed to order French forces to stop fighting in exchange for recognition of his authority over French North Africa. The order was controversial. Many Vichy loyalists viewed it as treason, but it ended the fighting. Jean Bart's crew received Darlan's ceasefire order with relief. They had been looking for a way to stop fighting without appearing to betray their oaths. Darlan's order provided that escape. They were not surrendering to the Americans. They were following orders from a superior French authority to cease hostilities. Honor was satisfied. Conscience was clear. American engineers came aboard Jean Bart on November 12th to assess damage and discuss repairs. What they found astonished them. The battleship had sustained multiple bomb and shell hits, but was still structurally sound. The forward turret, despite damage, could be repaired. The hull was intact. With proper support, Jean Bart could be made fully operational. But first, she would need to travel to the United States for repairs. Casablanca lacked the facilities to repair a battleship. American shipyards had the capacity and expertise. In early 1943, Jean Bart was towed to Casablanca's outer harbor and temporarily patched. In July 1943, she was towed across the Atlantic to the New York Naval Shipyard, arriving in August 1943. The tow across the Atlantic was itself remarkable. Jean Bart still had no propulsion. She was a 35,000-ton dead weight being pulled by tugs across 3,000 miles of ocean. The voyage took weeks with Jean Bart under tow the entire way. But she arrived safely and was dry-docked for assessment. American engineers determined that completing Jean Bart to her original design would require extensive work that could not be justified given other priorities. The ship would remain in the United States until the war in Europe ended. By then, French shipyards could complete the work. Jean Bart remained in American shipyards until 1945. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, she was towed back to France and entered Chantier de l'Atlantique in Saint-Nazaire, the same shipyard where she had been built. Work resumed on completing the battleship. The aft turret was installed. Engines were completed. Fire control systems were modernized. Secondary armament was upgraded with American weapons. The ship that had fled Saint-Nazaire incomplete in 1940 returned incomplete in 1945 to finally be finished. Jean Bart was commissioned into the French Navy in 1955, 15 years after fleeing France. She was one of the last battleships completed anywhere in the world entering service at a time when most navies were scrapping their battleships as obsolete. She served as flagship of the French Mediterranean Fleet through the 1950s, participated in the Suez Crisis in 1956, and was finally decommissioned in 1961. She was scrapped in 1970. The crew who served aboard Jean Bart at Casablanca in November 1942 dispersed to various fates. Captain Ronarc continued serving in the French Navy, eventually retiring as a vice admiral. Many of the officers who supported joining the Allies went on to distinguished careers in the post-war French Navy. Some Vichy loyalists were cashiered or court-martialed. Most crew members simply returned to normal naval service, their brief moment of choosing conscience over orders fading into personal history. The battle at Casablanca is remembered as a strange sideshow of Operation Torch, a battle that should never have happened between forces that should have been allies. American casualties were approximately 500 killed and 750 wounded during the 3 days of fighting. French casualties were approximately 700 killed and 400 wounded. Most died in confused fighting ashore, in destroyer actions and air attacks. Jean Bart's casualties were 8 killed and 52 wounded, relatively light, given the intensity of the action. The strategic impact of Casablanca was significant. Securing Morocco gave the Allies a major port for supplying forces in North Africa. French forces in North Africa, approximately 200,000 men, eventually joined the Allied cause, though their integration was politically complex and militarily challenging. Jean Bart's resistance delayed the capture of Casablanca by perhaps 48 hours, but it did not change the outcome. What makes Jean Bart's story remarkable is not its strategic importance, but its human dimension. A crew caught between conflicting loyalties, forced to choose between obeying orders and following their conscience. Officers who knew their government was wrong but could not simply abandon their oaths. Men who fought bravely against allies they respected, then stopped fighting when they could no longer justify what they were doing. The mutiny that wasn't quite a mutiny, the resistance that faded into technical impossibility, the battleship that refused to fight its allies, these are the human elements that make Jean Bart's story compelling. The crew did not dramatically refuse orders. They did not raise revolutionary banners or declare allegiance to de Gaulle. They simply stopped doing what they were told when what they were told made no sense. This form of resistance, quiet and bureaucratic, unmilitary and unheroic, was perhaps more effective than dramatic gestures would have been. By stopping without surrendering, by ceasing fire without hauling down their flag, the crew of Jean Bart allowed everyone to save face. Vichy authorities could claim the ship had not surrendered but had simply run out of ammunition. American forces could claim they had neutralized the threat without provoking a battle to the death. The crew could claim they had followed orders until circumstances made further action impossible. The truth was simpler. French sailors had refused to kill Americans in defense of a regime they despised. They had found a way to stop fighting without appearing to betray their oaths. They had chosen conscience over obedience, but they had done it quietly, without drama, in a way that allowed everyone to pretend it was something other than what it was. Jean Bart was the battleship that refused to fight its allies, not through dramatic mutiny but through patient refusal, not through revolutionary declarations but through technical objections, not through heroic gestures but through bureaucratic obstruction. It was a very French form of resistance, and it worked exactly as it needed to work. The guns fell silent, the killing stopped, and honor was satisfied on all sides. The battleship that fled France incomplete in 1940 fought the United States Navy in 1942 and was finally completed in 1955, embodied all the contradictions of France during World War II: courage and confusion, loyalty and betrayal, honor and collaboration. Jean Bart served governments that were wrong, fought allies she should have joined, and eventually found redemption by simply refusing to continue doing what made no sense. That refusal, quiet and undramatic, was perhaps the most important battle the ship ever fought. Not the duel with Massachusetts, not the air attacks, not the defense of Casablanca, but the crew's collective decision to stop fighting when ordered to continue. In that moment, the crew of Jean Bart demonstrated something more important than martial valor or technical competence. They demonstrated moral courage, the willingness to choose right over wrong, even when the choice was complicated, dangerous, and could easily have been punished as mutiny. The battleship is gone now, scrapped in 1970, reduced to steel ingots and scrap metal. But the story remains the story of a ship that refused to fight its allies, a crew that chose conscience over orders, and a battle that ended not with victory or defeat, but with quiet refusal. In the strange calculus of war, that refusal mattered more than any amount of fighting would have mattered. Sometimes stopping is braver than continuing. Sometimes silence is more powerful than gunfire. And sometimes refusing to fight is the most important battle of all.